You are listening to the Music Ed Mentor podcast, where we teach music educators how to build, manage, and grow thriving school music programs and have long and happy careers. I am your host, Elisa Jansen-Jones, and I am so pleased today to bring on a district fine arts administrator with a long career in music education, arranging, and composition to tap into alongside his administrative duties. Pete Hazzard is passionate about helping music teachers, and all teachers really, how to better communicate, collaborate, and cooperate. This is a real skill and one that we need to practice, especially now. As you'll hear in this episode, there's a big difference between collaboration and coordination. We're going to share some tips for how to work more effectively within your schools, how to build rapport with your coworkers when it can be so challenging right now with all the scheduling snafus and building placements and all of the many rules you have to follow to keep kids safe. We also touch on how you can more effectively feel like part of the community, which is something many music educators, myself included, have struggled with on occasion when we're in the building. And this feeling can be far more amplified now that many of us are teaching entirely online. But before we hop into this episode, I really want to thank you for spending this time with me. I know how incredibly valuable your time is right now, and to take this few minutes to relax and listen and just join us in this conversation means the absolute world to me. When I started this podcast 3.5 years ago now, I had no idea the type of impact that it would have on the music education community. It is truly a labor of love and a way that I serve you. If there is ever any topics that you would like us to cover, any interviews you'd like to listen to with certain people, or any specific lessons that you would really like us to teach, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find all the information you need on the show notes page for this or any of our Music Ed Mentor podcast episodes. You can find all of the show notes at smartmusic.com/blog. And speaking of Smart Music, they have led the way in this online learning revolution from the beginning. Not only are they working hard to support music teachers in the learning, teaching, and assessment of music students, but they are finding innovative ways to help support whether you are teaching entirely online, some sort of hybrid, or if you see students in your classroom every day. One of their newest innovations is that your students can now download and print a PDF copy of their musical assignments right at home or from the school computers. They are maximizing access to all the resources you need to create meaningful musical learning experiences for students of all ages. To learn more, simply visit smartmusic.com. While you're there, check out the show notes and sign up to get notifications for new episodes and new blog posts. Now, without further ado, let's talk about how we can better communicate, collaborate, and build community with Pete Hazzard.
Well, my name is Pete Hazzard. I'm the Managing Director of Fine Arts for Frisco ISD in Frisco, Texas. And we're a school district in the North Texas area with about 72 campuses serving about 65,000 students with comprehensive arts programs at all the different divisions and all the different levels. So that's my daytime job.
And what do you do for fun?
Well, what I do for fun is spend time with my family. You know, I'll also tell you I have several things on the side. I'm also a composer. And enjoy doing a lot of work in writing music for different bands and orchestras, as well as doing quite a bit of writing myself But most of my free time is spent with my family, who are involved in a lot of activities at their various schools, and two in college, and just enjoy spending time with them.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad to have you as my guest today. And I feel like all of the episodes recently, I mean, since the beginning of this podcast, my impetus has always been to help music educators in those off the podium type of skills. And this episode and the ones, most recently all kind of fall into that same bucket, except that instead of, we're dealing with unprecedented times. And so we need to look at unprecedented ways of helping music teachers, right? And,
Right.
I met you at Texas Bandmasters and talking about all of the work that we're having to do to get people playing and singing and all of that again. But I want to talk about what are the other skills that we should really be focusing on for us to be successful music educators, and have it come from your admin point of view.
What's so interesting about this time and space that we're in is that I think we continue talking about how this is a new normal, and we keep talking about giving grace, and we keep talking about dealing with change. But there are some things about what we're doing right now that are simply that are things that we would normally need to be really good at, that are just becoming magnified because of the compressed time schedules that we're in, as it relates to information that's coming out and our ability to respond and react in real time. But there are things that we've always had to do really well. And we're spending a lot of time with our teachers in particular in three different areas. And it's how are we going about communicating? How are we going about coordinating our efforts? And how are we going about collaborating? Because all three of those skill sets, while they're things that we always have to do well, they're things that we have to do differently in this new environment. And one of the things that I think is really unique about this time that we're in is that it's not just about all of the new that's around us. A lot of times we can find a lot of solace and comfort in latching onto those things that are things that we normally do, but trying to do it within this new environment. And so I think for us, where we're seeing is a shift in the balance of how we go about doing some of those normal things.
So are we kind of shooting ourselves in I hate using that term, but are we hamstringing ourselves in our communication skills? Like, what can we do internally? What change of thoughts or habitudes do we need to look at to improve our coordination and collaboration and communication?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think a big part of it is we tend to, in education, especially music education, use terms all the time that we really don't know we either don't know the meaning and definition of, or we don't know the extent of what it means. I think when we think about communication in particular, we have to think about that there's a difference between internal communication and external communication. When we talk about internal communication, that's developed for people within the team or within the tribe, for use within the team or within the tribe. And I use those terms on purpose because I think it's drilling down in regards to knowing when we need to email and how to go about emailing, whether or not we're using text messaging, all those things that help us to have a healthy functioning system within what we do. We have to consider those and have open dialogue about those ideas. There are also different systems of internal communication that sometimes we don't think beyond our own music education walls. But there's internal communication that also exists between how we work with our other colleagues within the fine arts department, other colleagues in other core academic areas, but also with campus administration. Those are all things that have to be handled internally. Now, why is that so important right now? I think in this day and age of wanting to have a little bit of cover as we're dealing with the community at large as it relates to COVID-19, I think sometimes we have this gut reaction to grab things that might be internal documents and get antsy and push those out without having those healthy internal communication issues or communication patterns that can create issues for other campus administrators and things having to answer to parents. So knowing that delineation of internal communication is really, really important. There's also an external communication pattern that we have to consider. This is everything from social media, our social media presence, to how we have our websites designed, but having that information set up in a way to be able to deliver information externally. We also, though, have to think a little bit more deeply, because usually we're just thinking about external communication as pushing information out to parents and students. But now we're starting to get more media requests. We're starting to get more inquiries from other areas that we have to be careful and make sure that we're slowing down enough on those external communication patterns to help connect the dots between departments within school districts. One of the things I have found right now in my role is that every single department, from transportation to communication to human resources to benefits, they're all intersecting at this moment in time. And so being able to communicate horizontally without any positional authority and really focusing on how we're going about communicating that information, I think is super important. I think a lot of times we shoot ourselves in the foot because we think about what we're communicating, but we don't think through the lens of how we're going about communicating. And how we communicate it is so much more important than the actual content sometimes, especially in a national pandemic like we're in.
Yeah, it comes down to knowing your audience, right? Who are you talking to? Where are they coming from? How much do they know about what we're doing? You know, in my earliest years of learning how to write, I was taught not to use acronyms and jargon that make you feel like you're smart, right? Oh, I know what DEI is, right?
Right.
But it makes other people feel like they are not following. So if we're really trying to be good communicators, we have to think about where our audience is coming from. It's the same as, you know, I wouldn't talk to an 11th grade band the same way that I'd talk to a first grade singing group. You know, they have different needs. They have different vocabulary. Right. They have different understanding. So I think that's a great point. That covers us on communication. What about like the collaboration bit? What can we do to be better collaborators? And is there a different definition of collaboration that we need to look at in this time?
Well, you know, one thing that I will say is that I think collaboration is one of those things that as a band, when I was in a band director role, and we would try to do things like musical theater productions, and there would be conflicts. I remember early on in my career thinking, well, why doesn't an administrator just step in and tell us that we have to figure this out and collaborate together? And I think the mind shift for us as music educators is the fact that collaboration is really not one of those things that can be forced. It can only be invited. And in this time where we're having to collaborate with so many people, we have to make sure that the culture that we've established within our program and with our greater campus community is one where that information and that feedback loop is rich and it's regular. You know, I think when we talk about how communication and collaboration are interrelated, and I think it's an important consideration to realize that a lot of times when we talk about norms through professional learning communities, which is a big buzzword in education right now, and I don't think that PLCs are, I don't think you do PLCs. I think we are a PLC. And that's part of the cultural development. But those norms that we talk about, I think a lot of times we think that once we establish those things or we establish that culture, we move on to the next thing. But in our communication about collaboration, we have to remember that frequency is just as important as volume. So the frequency of going back to and establishing those norms of collaboration, establishing those norms that we are going to work together to think solutions oriented, it has to continue being there. I think as a band director and as a music educator, a lot of times we don't want to sound like a barking chihuahua when it comes to communication, whether we're talking about whether we're talking about our culture or whether we're even going back as early as, how much a kid owes for a band fee or something. I think a lot of times we tend to back off on the communication part. But when we collaborate, we've got to make sure that communication plan, that internal communication plan is solid and that we're continuing to go back and revisit how we're going to go about doing our business and why that's so important.
And how do you see the difference between coordination and collaboration?
I think a lot of times when we think about the concept of coordination, we tend to downshift into making sure that our calendars work. We can have access to the auditorium or the marching field whenever we need it. And it's so much more than that. I think when we talk about coordination, I think it's about making sure that all of the different parts are syncing up at the same time. One of the things that is of incredible importance right now in this environment where we're starting to talk about how do we do face-to-face learners versus teaching virtual learners at the same time, we immediately jump into the what. We want vertical alignment in what we're teaching with our curriculum so that regardless of the delivery method that we have, students are having access to equitably excellent learning experiences and that they're going to grow as both a musician and as an artist and as a person, that they're going to grow in all of those areas by being involved in our programs. That's great, and we can have very robust and relevant curriculum documents, and it can be vertically aligned. But if we don't coordinate how we deliver that, and we don't figure out a way on how we coordinate that with the rest of what our curriculum and instruction departments are doing, it's going to create all kinds of organizational noise that parents and students on the other end of the screen aren't going to be able to sort through. And so I think that when we talk about coordination, yes, we're talking about vertical alignment of curriculum. That's really important. Yes, we're talking about project management calendars and we're talking about facilities. But most importantly, we're talking about how we coordinate our efforts to make sure that what we're doing in a fine arts classroom or a fine arts department is lining up with our curriculum colleagues to try to ease the access burden for parents and families on the other side of the screen, especially as we're living in this concurrent dual environment.
See, that's hard though, because I feel like, at least for me, I'm a very independent learner, independent person. I almost want to be in a silo, right? Like, you all go do your thing, I'll do my thing, and it will be amazing. So what are the advantages of us getting out of our classroom, out of our silo, out of our swim lane, and working with others? What are those advantages? It just seems like it's a hassle to me.
Well, and I'll tell you, I think that there are a lot of advantages. What's so interesting about this time right now is we keep using the word advocacy. Like, we've got to advocate for our programs. And as music educators, we've talked about this for decades, about advocating for the importance of music education. And we're always so open and honest about the fact that integrated and immersive arts experiences can really change the life of a child. But I think a lot of times, again, we go back to the things that we think are important, and we define terminology without giving it a lot of legs to be able to move forward on. I think this is an opportunity to do that. I think as we're trying to figure out concurrent teaching models, I think what we do in fine arts, I think the way that I see music educators run rehearsals in the most effective and efficient environment has a lot to say with how we approach learning in these concurrent models. We're doing a lot of work internally in Frisco right now about developing what these teaching models will look like. And as I'm involved in conversations with curriculum instruction, we're actually having open conversations about what it is that happens in a band rehearsal and how that can transfer over to teaching not only the different kinds of learners that teachers have in front of them, but the different methods of instructional delivery. We deal with that all the time in a band rehearsal, right? Like, we're talking to oboes, we're talking to flutes, we're talking to saxophones simultaneously, but we're having to teach just intonation versus equal temperament, and how they adjust in completely different mechanical systems. In a lot of ways, that's exactly what we're dealing with in this concurrent teaching environment. So I think the advantages to us come from the advocacy part of what we're talking about. I think we have an opportunity to be the indispensable problem-solving solution on our campuses, in our curriculum development in this environment. And as we do that, there's an opportunity for us to give. There's also an opportunity for us to take. as a fine arts administrator, one of the things that I'm learning is I immediately want to go to the ensemble route. Like, how am I going to figure out this concurrent model of having an ensemble experience with some people on a screen and some people face to face? And I have learned in talking with a lot of my art teachers about how they go about dealing with such great project-based learning, that there are some things that we can take from them in regards to how they're monitoring their classes, just in terms of classroom management, that can help some of our teachers as we build this model. So I think it is a give and take. I think it's an opportunity to give back and give some feet to the advocacy stuff that we talk about all the time. But it's also an opportunity for us to look at best practices from some other areas to figure out how we can supplement that immersive integrated arts experience that already exists in our music classroom.
Yeah, I love that. There's so much we can learn from other teachers. Even though I just admitted that, yes, I like to be in a silo, but that doesn't mean we can't work with others and support each other. I love teaching elementary music because my students have that classroom teacher. They are my number one collaborators. I love it.
You know what I was going to say, what's so interesting about this is I think the hardest part for us as music educators is what Carol Dweck talks about in regards to mindset. You know, we have got to stop thinking about doing band or doing orchestra or doing choir the way that it's always been done. We have to think instead about taking band or choir or orchestra or elementary music and giving students that experience. It's going to look a little bit different. And when we approach this with a more open mindset, then we're more willing to allow that communicative collaboration to take place. And that giving and take can be a little bit more fluid and more organic. We have to open our eyes to the things that are going on around us, and we've got to figure out how those things connect. I'm reading a great book right now called Range by David Epstein that talks about that the success level of the most successful people really come from people in history that have a broad landscape. They look at and take skill sets from different areas, and over time they're the ones that figure out how to put that together into a cohesive whole. And that sometimes, and he takes a lot of it from sports analogies, the worst thing that can happen is early specialization. That the best thing that we can do for students, the best thing that we can do as learners, is to continue to develop a broad range of experiences and then intentionally work to bring those together. I think that's exactly what we're talking about in this environment. We're talking about taking technology. We're talking about looking at our core subject areas. We're talking about taking experiences that we have in our band and our choir and our orchestra rooms and trying to bring those experiences together into a new delivery system. But if we have that closed mindset where we're just trying to do band as we've always done it, we're going to find a lot of frustration. So I think the mindset right now is super important. And you said that a minute ago about our elementary music teachers. Those are the real heroes right now, because if we're really smart, those are the people we're leaning on to try to figure out how to juggle all of them.
It's so true. They are masters of classroom management.
Yes, they are.
I mean, otherwise they just don't work. But you made me think of one of my favorite quotes, and it's kind of how I try to live my own life, which is know something about everything and everything about something.
Yes. You know, one of the things that I learned when I moved from the classroom into administration was that one of the hardest changes in mindset was moving from a specialist to a generalist. And I think a lot of times, going back to the communication piece, that's what becomes such a difficulty as music teachers are talking with their campus administrators, because we as music educators come to the table with a very specific skill set, and it's a specialist skill set. We spent thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of hours developing, whether it's becoming a great trumpet player into becoming a band director, whatever. And then when we get in front of a campus principal, they come to the table with a generalist mindset. And both are so incredibly important. But we have to work diligently to create more of a generalist mindset and see things bigger picture. When I moved into this administrative role, all of the things I had done as a band director, this long list of cool things that I got to do, all of a sudden meant nothing, because the people I was dealing with each and every day, they didn't know what Midwest was. They didn't know what honor band was, or all of those things. And so for me, that transition from a specialist mindset to a generalist mindset, I had to be very, very intentional about it. And I had to be very thoughtful about it. And I will tell you, to this day, it's still one of those things that as I read and as I look, I have to be very vulnerable in learning in those areas and continuing to try to develop and learn. I think right now, as music educators, we have to realize that's an intentional step that we have to take, because learning something about everything is so important right now, because the landscape of what we're doing, number one, has changed right now. But number two, none of us has the magic 8-ball to know how this builds itself out into the future. And so I think that as we develop these new skill sets, these are things that, number one, we're going to be called on to continue to have to integrate and look into as we move forward, but that we also have the opportunity to integrate and utilize as we move forward, both in how we communicate, how we coordinate, and how we collaborate with one another.
I think that's wonderful advice. I have two things. Thing number one being, are you sure we shouldn't just march into the principal's office and say, I'm the music teacher and I shouldn't have to do anything but music or worry about anything but music? You hired me to do music, music, music.
Right? And the answer to that is no. Again, I want to go back to something I said earlier. We have to be the absolute indispensable resource for finding solutions on our campuses and our districts right now. And I will tell you, in a time, at least in Texas, where things are fluid and they're changing day by day, we're going to see a lot of changes as we move throughout the course of the year. I think as students flex in and out of virtual versus face-to-face teaching, we're going to have to remain nimble as well. The more nimble the situation, the more nimble we have to be as parts of that system. And so whether it's facilities, whether it is we're dealing with teaching loads and additional assignments, or support for the mechanics of what happens while students are on campus, we have to continue to be flexible and remain nimble. Because if we dig our heels in and we end up becoming that stumbling block for campus administrators, that they're looking for solutions also. And if we're not part of the solution, if we become the problem, then we become irrelevant at that point. And that barking chihuahua voice that I mentioned earlier ends up becoming us. And we don't want to become that. We want to be the indispensable, solutions-oriented people that our campus and district level administrators are running to help find solutions.
So here's a little devil's advocate thing that does not come from me. It comes from my dad, bless him, for not having to live through what we're having to go through in music education right now. Yeah, long story there for another time. But I once toyed with the idea of getting certified to teach special education, right? And just to get an extra certification. Or maybe PE, right? Physical education. Come on, I'd freaking love that, you know?
Yeah.
With the idea that were I not able to find a job in music, at least I would have these other certifications that would make me marketable, right? Make me more of a generalist, make me somebody who's adaptable. And he said, oh, don't do that. If you do that, they'll only ever hire you to teach the other stuff, and you'll never get hired to teach music. And they'll always use it as an excuse to not have the music teacher, or they'll shrink the music classes and put you in all of these other things instead.
Right. Well, and I'll tell you, in our situation, we're very fortunate in that we have a lot of people that want to come to our school district right now. And I would tell you, we have very high standards and expectations for the kinds of teachers that we're hiring in our district, that they're not only certified, but they have qualifications above just certification. But I will tell you, in an environment right now where there are teacher shortages, that principals are having to think outside of the box within the ramifications or within the guidelines of legal guidance about certifications, to try to fill the needs that exist within the environment that we're in. So my suggestion is always to be able to have that open communicative conversation with your campus principals to see what you can do, but always continuing to make sure that what happens within your particular job assignment becomes the priority. But I do think that we have some situations where we are going to be pulled in some different directions for weird things like restroom duty and lunch duty to make sure that students are socially distant, that maybe we end up having to give up assisting a colleague in a band rehearsal or something like that. We are going to have to be flexible in that environment just because of the sheer logistics of keeping students safe and keeping all those the requests and requirements up to date where they need to be.
So what you're saying is we should be open communicators who focus on our audience and communicating to them using the language that they know, that we should be open to working with others, both supporting them while they support us, that we should be more generalist and think with a team-like mindset and be willing to be flexible. What other tips do you have us for right now from your awesome administrator perspective? What else can we do?
One of the most tangible things that I would suggest is I utilize something that I call a communication compact that we use. It's in an informal nature that we use internally all the time to help develop the kind of communication patterns that are appropriate for different kinds of communication, for different times of communication. One of the things that we did with our teachers last spring, whenever we went into hiding because of the zombie apocalypse, was we were really clear that campus administrators, district administrators, teachers have got to have a break. And it's really easy when we're working from home to just keep the computer on 24/7 and fire an email or a text off at any point that we have a thought. So one of the things that we did was we sat down kind of through this communication compact process that we go through to determine that we were going to hold tightly to trying not to do email or text outside of business hours so that people could have that brain break and have that time to recoup and take care of themselves. Now that we're in this different environment, we've started going back through that and trying to develop frequency of communication and methods of communication that are going to be the most appropriate for right now. So as an example, as part of those conversations, instead of me sending weekly emails to our teachers, I'm sending short weekly videos to our teachers because I think it's important when we're in a virtual learning pattern right now. I think it's important for them to not just be reading on a screen, but to actually see that interaction and be able to have that time. The other thing that I would say would be a tangible, appropriate process that's helpful and tip is at the end of any project, at the end of any major initiative, we go through a process that's called an after action review. And there are 3 or 4 strategic questions that we have developed to help us at the end to go into an immediate evaluation phase of what happened, how it ended up developing the way that it developed, and what adjustments need to be made the next time around to make sure that what we're doing aligns with our why. And I have found as we go through that process, we're able to stay focused on the things that we can control, and we learn to let go of things that we cannot control. Internally within our office, we just went through that process after we finished our professional development for the school year, the Fine Arts Day that we had at the beginning of August, because we ended up having to mega batch the rest of our professional learning days into the beginning of the school year to help teachers learn how to facilitate Canvas and Zoom and all these other things that they're having to do. So we ended up with really only one content day. And so that after action review allowed us in real time to go back and evaluate what gaps might be there for our teachers so that we can figure out different methods where we can go back and try to fill some of those in. So the 2 things that I would say is, number 1, a communication compact to go through and have very specific conversations with staff members, with other fine arts teachers, and with administrators to be able to develop those internal communication patterns are really important. And then number two is that after action review, to try to keep those activities and ways to improve at the forefront of our minds in real time, to determine what things can we control and adjust and what things are out of our control that we need to respond.
Well, Pete, this has been so awesome. It's great to hear from the administrative perspective, especially yours with your background in band and orchestra and music teaching in general, right? So it's wonderful to hear your advice. Thank you so much. It's so, you know how necessary it is right now.
Well, I tell you what, we've got to figure out how to get through this together. And I think that the network of music educators is unlike anything else in the country. And if there's one group of people that are nimble, that are forward thinking, that are intentional, and can help campuses right now, it's the music educators on the campus. We just have to be intentional and step into the space and be the leaders and influencers that we're called to do. And so anything we can do to help, that's what we want to do. And I appreciate the time and giving me a platform to be able to talk about some of my ideas. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again and again for joining me for this episode. Sometimes we forget how essential the soft skills are for us to learn and work on and practice. Skills like confidently reaching out when we need help. Skills like listening and doing more than hearing what our coworkers are saying, but really seeking for understanding. It's important now more than ever for us to practice collaboration, to creatively communicate, to reach out in ways that are meaningful for others, especially for our students, because that's what this is all about. Remember to visit the show notes page for this episode to discover any of the links or resources that we shared. You can find that and so much more at smartmusic.com/blog. Until next time, my friends, keep teaching on.